Welcome to F.L.O.W.cast. I'm your host, Sister Beth Murphy. Enriching, meaningful conversation is hard to come by these days, isn't it? There's a general distrust of facts and so much misinformation and disinformation floating in digital spaces that even agreeing on basic truths is fraught with challenges. But what if there's a way through? What would it look like to practice conversation in a way that might cool the frenzied fires being lit in our social media spaces every day? If there is anyone who can help us unpack this question, it's today's guest, Adrian Dominican, Sister Patricia Walter. Sister Pat and I first met at Aquinas Institute of Theology, where I was a master's student and she a professor of Christology. That was a long time ago. What I remember about that class was the way Pat helped us students interrogate our own thinking as we attempted to thread our way through complex arguments about the nature of Jesus the Christ. I have no doubt Sister Pat will be equally probing in this conversation, in which we will attempt to rescue for the 21st century a practice from the 13th century that became a hallmark of Dominican life then and is now a gift to the needs of our world today. That is disputatio, or disputation, a process of discernment of truths. So let's get started. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you for the kind introduction.
It's wonderful to be with you after all these years.
Really, I'm not sure I have all the solutions or even a good one, Beth, but we can offer it and see how it can be used, huh?
All right, let's see what happens. Let's dig in. So our revered Dominican ancestor, St. Thomas Aquinas, was supposed to have said, rarely affirm, seldom deny, always distinguish. I think that's a fair explanation of disputatio, which is the topic for our conversation today. Would you think so? Can you unpack it for us a little bit?
I do. I think it's a kind of wonderful axiom. Rarely affirm means that there are times when you would agree with somebody completely or 100%. Seldom deny means that what you're doing is expecting that your conversation partner has some claim to truth, and you're listening for what that is. Always distinguish means that we get caught up in the various meanings of words, in the various contexts they have, and frequently, I know for myself, being kind of an introverted thinker, I'll say something and it's not quite exactly what I meant, or it's answering another question in my head that you didn't ask me. So that's where to make a distinction. This might be true in these cases. However, what about this case that we're talking about right now? Oh, it doesn't apply. So I think it's a way of generously entering into dialogue, generously and critically and respectfully entering into dialogue where you really see your interlocutor as having some claim to truth.
You know, I remember that you were so great at that when I was a student. And, you know, what that kind of conversation does and you have to have the time to have that kind of conversation. You know, it can't be rushed. But when you have those kinds of conversations, it really sharpens your own thinking. And I just find that so valuable. So I appreciate you saying that.
Mm-hmm. Right. You know, I mean, one of the exercises I used, which I'm sure you're referring to, Beth, was what's called to take a stand on an imaginary continuum and to say something like Jesus had to die. Well, people could agree or disagree. And that might seem startling at first, but then you have to listen to why everyone else stands there. And it might be someone simply says, well, Jesus had to die because he was human. Jesus had to die because God sent him to die for our sins. Jesus had to die because he was a threat to the establishment. You know, all kinds of reasons where people might look like they're in opposing positions, but they might really agree. with some significant details.
Hmm. Well, and that's where Thomas's axiom comes in really handy, right? Rarely affirm, seldom deny, and always distinguish. Make sure that you understand what the other person is saying clearly by asking questions and making distinctions in terms. So that's a really good tip for anybody who wants to engage in a deep and I would say slow conversation, you know?
Right. You're so right about time. And the other thing is, you really do a service, because sometimes I find myself saying something and I'm really not sure exactly what I mean by it. So if you get in there, Beth, and sympathetically start engaging me and saying, well, do you mean this? And I'll say, well, not exactly. Or can you help me understand why you said that? Well, because of this. So that at the end of the conversation, and it is similar to Plato's dialogues in a way, you come out with a clearer understanding of your own position.
Sure, and that can only be a good thing.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's good for you understand your own thinking. And you mentioned a minute ago that you said it's because you're an introverted thinker. And I have the exact opposite problem. I'm a very extroverted thinker. Sometimes I don't even know what I think until I say it out loud. And you've got to give me the time to correct myself after it comes out of my mouth. So it sounds like we're both in the same place, even there, even though we have two different personality styles.
That's right. And to know that is very, very helpful, because I lived with someone who was an extrovert, and first words out of her mouth, I thought, oh, okay, that's her position. And then she'd go into a second position and a third position. And I'd start getting a headache, and finally I thought, okay, I'll listen after about the fourth position and maybe that's what she's arrived at.
Believe me, anybody who knows me well is going to laugh at that because they will recognize something true there. You know, I'm just trying to get a little bit at the history of this process. And from what I could determine, if I've got my facts straight, the art of disputatio goes back to the Mesopotamian region around 8th century before the Christian era. That's a long time ago and long before the Dominicans arrived on the scene. So I'm wondering if you can tell us anything about how that practice found its way into the 13th century schools of theology in Europe.
I really can't. I don't know if it came because the Greek philosophical works, which had been lost for a long time and had been translated into Arabic, found their way to Europe with the return of the Crusaders and the movement of Arabs into the Mediterranean area. I don't know if it's because the universities did the trivium and quadrivium, which means that they were doing logic and all kinds of formal disciplines. And this is a very fine way of working with logic. But I really don't know, and it'd be wonderful if somebody in your listening audience knew and could inform us both, huh?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that happens. And it wasn't really just the Dominicans that were using this tool. Was it this happening in all of the universities in the 13th century?
Oh, it was a big form of entertainment. No bullfights, but what you would do, the students would gather at one of the colleges, which basically was a school and a residence hall run by some master, and they would have once in a while they would have what they called the quod libet, which means at will, which means anybody could come and ask any master who was participating a question about anything. So they really had to be on their toes. More usually, it would be a master in his own school, college, residence hall, who would pose the question and get some student to defend it, somewhat akin to debates today. Someone would take one side of the question, and then people would raise objections, and the student would show how well they had studied, listened, et cetera, because they would respond to the objections of other students. So that was a pretty common way of learning. And what I have to say about it is, it's a very engaging way. The students could hardly be passive. You fall asleep in one of those and you'll be sorry because you'll probably be the next one up to defend something.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that is really interesting, and I'm going to take a little bit of a risk here, and because who comes to mind? You said this was a form of entertainment to the university, and what comes to mind for me is Charlie Kirk, who, in a way, attempted a similar process on college campuses. I am not sure that he had the same end in mind as the master teachers at the universities in medieval Europe. And I think that's probably where the method parts ways between the Middle Ages and what Charlie Kirk was doing. What would you say about that? Do you think I'm on the right track there? Or?
I have to confess, I'm not all that familiar with him. What I wonder, because again, I really haven't watched any of his YouTubes or talks or whatever, but it seems like he took questions from everybody. The I'm not sure how much he really wanted to engage with them and learn what their truth was, or whether he really wanted to prove his truth to them. You see, so if he, you know, as you said, it's a slow process, and it can be, I guess, boring because what he would need to do to be doing disputation would be somebody poses a question. Well, he would have to name all the objections to it. You know, is God good? Well, God doesn't seem to be good because God is beyond good. Well, it doesn't seem like God is good because the world is a mess, et cetera, et cetera. So and then what you've got to do is quote some authority. Um, you know, ideally the Bible, one of the fathers of the church, maybe even Aristotle, and who basically represents or endorses your position. And then you say what your own position is, and then you have to go back through every single objection and honor again what the person is saying or the truth claim they make, or to make the distinction between, yes, the world is a mess, and God is working at all times to save it. So there's a distinction there, you know, or to say God is not the world, or this is where human responsibility comes in. You know, I mean, if those were the kind of objections, that would be how I would do that. I answer that. God is good, and the world can stand improvement.
Yes, it's a both and kind of question. And you're right. I know little about Charlie Kirk, but what I have seen of his sessions on college campuses, he did seem to me to be more interested in promoting his own agenda than he was in getting at any kind of a broader truth. And his sessions were very fast paced. There was nothing slow about them. And that was one of his techniques, in fact. He would barely give his interlocutor any time to think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, mm,
That's difficult, especially when you think about a college student who's trying to formulate his or her own position, mostly his, probably.
mhm,
Um, you know, at that age of 18 to 21.
mhm. Right,
Um,
exactly. It's hard to do um, as an adult, let alone as a young person, I think.
true,
Yeah,
true.
yeah. Let's get back to the order for a minute. What can you tell us about the 13th century context that made Dominicans so concerned about and attentive to safeguarding truth? Veritas, after all, we have many mottos in the order, you know, but Veritas is our primary one, truth. What was happening in the 13th century that made that important to our ancestors in the order?
The biggest thing was that there was movement of peoples. There was the movement of the Crusaders back from the Holy Land and from the Middle East. There were merchants that came along with them, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, those crusaders had had contact with Eastern religions like Zoroastrianism. They had experienced this kind of dualism of a good God who is beyond creation and a bad God who created. So there were a lot of errors being introduced about the value and the origin of creation and who God is. That was one piece. Then there was the movement of people's, in the early Middle Ages, low Middle Ages, whatever. Uh, People were really bound by the land. If you were a serf, you belonged on a certain land and you were tied to some overlord. Anybody who didn't have a master was very suspect. It was a really hierarchical structure. Traders and merchants and various people started moving through kingdoms, the jonglers, the entertainers, et cetera, et cetera. There was more and more mobility. And the young people flocked to what began to emerge as cities. So you've got the universities, and there's a real opportunity there to teach and to search for truth. So part of it was Dominic's experience when he was traveling with his bishop through southern France was you had the Cathars or the Albigensians. They were really dualist. And the most perfect of them wouldn't eat any food, wouldn't have sexual relations, would do as little as possible with the material world. And so the ideal, I guess, would be to just starve yourself to death. Then you would really be the perfect one. Well, again, Dominic saw that and Diego, the bishop, saw that as a real affront to the beauty and the goodness of creation, the value of human life, the goodness that God gave us in cooperating with bringing forth life. So, and they were very worried about what that was doing to people. And there was also the threat that if these folks kept persisting in this, the Pope sent a crusade. It was the first crusade against any Christian country. And in the town of Béziers, there was absolute slaughter. Almost everybody in the town was slaughtered. It was just vile. So, weighing on Dominic was the fact that if people did not convert, they could well get put to death. So, how do you persuade people of God's goodness, of their own goodness, of the goodness of creation? Um, I mean, that yes, Jesus was a poor preacher. Um, and we need to listen to Jesus's teachings. And yes, the church needs reform. But that was the context, I think, is that kind of movement, which then made the order one that was noted for itinerancy. Go where you can, go to the best universities, go to where the students are, get the education, engage the students, engage the finest minds you can, because what we need to do is have disputatios, with heretics, and also often what we see are members of the Jewish religion. That there would be public disputations on the truths of Christianity versus Judaism.
You know, what you're saying, I'm finding so many parallels with our own time. Context was different. Certainly, the knowledge base was very different in the 13th century than it is today. The parallels between the 13th century and today. I keep going back to that word slow conversation. There's this slow food movement where people want to be able to sit down and, cook with leisure and enjoy the food with leisure. And I can't help but think of the same need here. Um, I was almost jealous as you were describing those sessions at the university where the masters and the students would gather. It was their form of entertainment, and I think I never realized that. It
Well, and
was
that might be a little overstatement on my part, but you could probably talk about bear baiting and getting drunk in taverns, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll say it was a form of intellectual entertainment.
there you go. And, I think we can go with that. So, um, let's just say that we want to put this technique into practice. How can we make this model of disputatio work for us? Let's just say maybe around the Thanksgiving table while we're with our families. Now, I don't know that we're going to have this same kind of intellectual conversation while we're enjoying turkey and stuffing or whatever happens to be our family tradition. But what can we take from disputatio for our own conversation?
Well, your first thing is it's got to be slow. I was all for universal access to healthcare. I think it's a human right. I couldn't really understand why anybody was opposed to it. And I got to actually, it was the Christmas table. And my youngest sister, whom I love dearly and is just 100% good gold, and her husband were talking about how difficult it was for them. They had no children, they were relatively young. Um, Again, she's probably 15 years younger than I. And their healthcare premiums had skyrocketed to cover other people who didn't have income and who weren't insured, you know. So they were relatively healthy. And the question then is, do we even participate? Well, I was so glad that I didn't engage in, well, you're wrong kinds of things. I think part of it is because I love my sister so dearly that I thought, if Eileen is thinking this is not a good idea, there's something I need to learn from her. And sure enough, it was a context. I belong to a congregation. We pay for healthcare premiums or whatever collectively. So I never see a check for that. So I don't know what's been raised, lowered, or what. For Eileen and Greg, excuse me, it was a significant adjustment to their budget. So what was helpful for that was for me to see another perspective in how this affected people. So it was not that they weren't concerned about other people, it was the cost. Now, had we had the time and opportunity to pursue the conversation, I might have gone with something like universal coverage, where everyone shares the cost. But it was, as I say, it was the Christmas dinner. But that was such a learning for me of always trying to ask the question: can you help me understand? Can you help me? What in your experience kind of prompts you to take that position? And where could I agree? I could agree that they shouldn't have to be paying $2,000 more a year so that everybody has access to health care, perhaps. But I need to find that out. To look and to say, where is our common ground? They didn't disagree that healthcare was a good. I'm not sure they would have taken it as far as a right. So, and that's where, again, what are the distinctions? What are the use of words? To say that they were selfish or unchristian, or I was being naive or, liberal, or there you go, the nun. What does that do? It dismisses my claim to truth and it puts me in a box. And then you can shut the lid and you don't have to pay any attention to what I'm saying. So that's, I think, one of the things that we can do. That stance of curiosity. Why is it? I mean, what have you seen? What have you heard that leads you to think that? So part of it is, one of the real dilemmas today is we have two universes of news, right? I mean, we have just two different sources, two different ways of looking at the world, two different sets of facts, alternative truths, as they were been called. So, so it's very difficult to come to, what are your authorities? In the Middle Ages, they agreed on what the authorities were. Well, I don't agree with some of the folks on some television or radio stations as being authorities I would recognize. So then where do you go? That's the dilemma.
Right. And there's a question of trust that comes in. We're not trusting our sources of news. I want to get to that, but I'd like to back up because I don't want to miss something that you said earlier. Um, Driving to work this morning, I had public radio on, and they were interviewing a Republican lawmaker, and it was like a breath of fresh air. I came in halfway in the middle of the story, but they were actually talking about healthcare. And he said, healthcare is working for no one right now. And he said, this should not be a partisan issue. All of our people are hurting, and we need to find a solution. And I was so relieved to hear this man say that because I think that's really true. It doesn't work, it's not working for everyone. And so he said, I am not for repeal and replace. He said, I don't think that's the answer, but we have to put our heads together and come up with a solution that's going to work for the most Americans. And I thought that is the most sensible thing that I have heard about healthcare in a long time. And it really gave me some hope, to hear
And
him say that.
it shows several levels of common ground, right? It's not working for anybody. Uh, I had to wait from April to October to see a specialist for a second opinion on my knee. Now, I don't know, people would say, well, socialized medicine does that. You have to wait or you can't get in to see somebody. Well, April to October is a very long time, I think. And it
Mhm.
wasn't like heart surgery. But so I think he's talking about common ground. What he's talking about is human beings. He's not talking about poor and rich, sick and healthy, uh, blue and red, whatever, whatever. It's human beings are hurting. Now, so I mean, there's just a number of things in his reply that, yes, of course, you would say, yes, I agree with you completely on that. And let's roll up our sleeves together and see what solutions we can find.
Yes, and like I said, I just took a lot of consolation from that because I think that's where we need to be. But to get back to this issue of trust, I cannot tell you. It seems to me that in the past couple of weeks, I have had at least three, if not four, different conversations that go like this. And of course, and I think many of our listeners know, that I was trained as a journalist. That's my background. And these conversations really got my hackles up, I have to say, because they were people just saying to me with absolute certainty that every journalist is dishonest and crooked and is not telling the truth. Well, that is just not true. That's not true. And and I find it very difficult to combat that. But there were two women. I didn't really know them. They came to visit the mother house, and I was giving them a tour of our chapel when this came up. And they were really asking the question, honestly, where do we go for news that we can trust? And so I gave them my usual answer, which is those sources of news that have a way of fact checking and proving whether something is right or wrong. And I said, you're, for the most part, not going to find them in your social media feed.
Right,
So
right.
you need to actually subscribe to a newspaper or a magazine or some other online periodical that can prove to you that they are adhering to the standards of journalism. And it felt to me like, why should I even have to say that? But here we are, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, that's the puzzling thing. Maybe we're going to hit all the hot topics here, but why somebody would trust, uh, you know, On what authority do you trust somebody about whether your kid should be vaccinated or not? Where do you find the research? Um, we're just talking about, places where the whole hospital ward was full of little kids with polio. Uh, Probably many of whom died, and the rest of them were paralyzed. Um, so why would you, why? For me, it's a hard thing of saying, but I lived in the 50s and I lived through not being able to go outside and the reality of polio and the relief when the vaccine got discovered. But, why would this particular group of people, why would you listen to them rather than to the Center for Disease Control? And a lot of times it's like, oh, well, they're all tied in with big pharma. Well, unfortunately, yes, we have a lot of money in a lot of places that it shouldn't be in. That's really true. Now, the other thing I'd say, though, Beth, is there's a wonderful quote: before you can search for truth, you must be interested in finding it.
Oh,
Do you really
beautiful.
want to find it? Because it might change your view on things. It might change who your friends are. It might change what your sources of authority are. Another thing is, why do others think differently than I? Even if I think, that's the thing, I was so glad I could get curious with my youngest sister. I mean, I think I'm right 99% of the time, but why do others think differently? If
I
I can
wonder.
if I can get that stance, and it might be experience, it might be sometimes it's they're using the word differently. Uh, so, what's their claim to truth? And what Thomas says is even with those you disagree with, they perform a real service to you because they give you a fuller grasp of the truth. They give you a fuller view of things. So, there's, well, I suppose there are things to worry about because maybe you do have to change your life once you get to the truth. But um, usually, I think people are happy to get a fuller sense of what I mean, we're talking about reality.
Sure. We talk about truth setting us free. So there is a freedom in coming to know what is real and what is true. Um, and I think that this conversation has been really, I hope for our listeners, a wonderful reflection on that. I have really enjoyed it. Do you have any further reflections that you want to share?
No, it's been a wonderful exercise preparing for it and thinking about it again. And there's even the word truth. There's a book by Anne Garrido, who taught at Aquinas Institute, and she talks about 5 different dimensions of truth. And I think that's, so when people say, what is truth? Well, it depends. Again, does it mean uh, the conformity of something to reality? Does it mean that what you would die for? My own truth is Jesus is my Lord and Savior, et cetera, et cetera. So even the word truth is not, can be distinct and
Hmm.
distinguished.
Hmm.
But no,
And
I
it's a
thoroughly enjoyed it, Beth.
Oh, good. Well, me too. The time has gone way too fast. I think you and I could go for at least another 30 minutes. Um, I hope our listeners will let me know, but I think we've transformed what could sound like an esoteric topic, disputatio. Anytime you say something in Latin, it sounds so impressive. But I think we've provided some thoughtful and practical advice for people who might want to experience a slow conversation about something that really matters to them. This is not the kind of conversation you have over the dinner table when you're trying to catch up with your spouse and your kids to find out what went on during the day, right? Um, but to encourage people to give over some time. This episode is going to actually land on Thanksgiving weekend, and people will hopefully have some leisure time that they might not otherwise have. So, do you have some time for a slow conversation about something that's important to you? Um, I'll share in the show notes some of the resources that we've mentioned. Ann Garrido's book especially, and she has a couple of really wonderful websites that she's associated with where you can learn more as well. So those will be in the show notes for this episode. Just a reminder to our audience that a new podcast, 𝐻𝐿ow.cast podcast, drops on the fourth Thursday of every month. And you can find us anywhere you get your podcasts by searching the keyword 𝐻𝐿ow.cast listen, or by visiting our website, which is 𝐻𝐿ow.castlisten.org. And if you go to our website, you can subscribe to the podcast and have every episode delivered right to your inbox. So you'll be the first to know. So on behalf of the Dominican Sisters of Springfield and the 𝐻𝐿ow.cast team, which includes Brandon Durham and Jean Ann Miller and myself, thank you so much, Pat, for joining me today. Thank you to our listeners, and until next month, God bless you and God bless yours.
Thank you, and the same back to you and Brandon.
And happy Thanksgiving to you. It's going to be right around the corner.
Yeah, you got that right. Okay, take care.